Okay, it's now on. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome. We are honored to have with us Professor Simon Borg, a pioneer whose work has fundamentally shaped how we understand what language teachers think, know, believe, and do. Professor Borg began his teaching career in 1988 in Malta, later completing his PhD at the University of Exeter in the UK. Over the years, he has held academic positions in New Zealand and the UK, including serving as professor of TESOL at the University of Leeds. He is also a visiting professor at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. Since 2014, Professor Borg has worked internationally as an independent consultant, designing and supporting large-scale teacher professional development initiatives around the world. His ability to connect research with practice has made his work highly impactful for educators, institutions, and ministries of education globally. Many of you will know his landmark 2003 review article on teacher cognition, a piece that continues to influence research across language education. His book, Teacher Cognition and Language Education, further expanded the field by highlighting how cognitive, emotional, social, and historical factors shape teachers' professional worlds. These contributions have not only broadened our understanding of teaching, but have also inspired countless researchers and practitioners to examine teacher thinking in more nuanced and meaningful ways. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Simon Borg. We are delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you very much, Professor Simon.
Thank you very much. Well, what a wonderful introduction that was. I've obviously got a lot to live up to and a lot to apologize for, it seems. So thank you for joining us. I know it's the start of your day, start of the end of the week for you. I hope to make it, the early start worthwhile for you today. And thank you to Edgar for pursuing me over recent months to ensure that we're able to meet here today. I've been looking forward to it. So the topic I've chosen for today's talk is connected in a way to teacher cognition, but we're taking a specific focus on assessment, and we'll look at how teachers might think about assessment in a slightly different way in order to make it a more positive experience for their students. So I'll launch my presentation in a second. I'll talk for maybe 40 minutes. We'll see how it goes, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. We're a nice small group, so that should be feasible. And thank you once again for joining us today. All right, let's launch then. Okay, let me just see. Sorry, I'm just fiddling around with my settings here. Let me try again. Okay, so what can you see on your screens? You can see the presentation, I hope?
Yes, we can see it.
And I don't think you really need to see me, but if you can see me as well, I'm sure you can
we
put
can
up with it.
No.
Okay, great. So making assessment a positive experience. Let's start from thinking about core teacher activities. So if we think about what it is fundamentally that teachers do, it's planning, teaching, and assessment. Of course, there are other aspects of the job, but those are the three we can boil it down to if we want to think of priorities. And our specific focus today is assessment. And when we talk about assessment, we mean collecting evidence and making judgments or forming opinions about learners' knowledge, skills, and abilities. So as you'll appreciate, assessment is broader than testing, broader than examining. It involves all the ways in which we collect evidence and in order to reach conclusions about what our learners know and can do. And that will be our focus today. In many contexts, of course, assessment remains strongly associated with testing and examinations. That's still the case in many contexts, but as you'll appreciate, assessment should mean much more than that. Now, we have a picture here of a glacier, and as you know, glaciers are very, very slow-moving rivers of ice, and assessment is in some ways similar to a glacier because assessment practices do tend to change extremely slowly. There are many teachers around the world who assess their students in the way that the teachers were assessed when they were students many, many years before, and perhaps in the way that their teachers taught them generations previously. So there is a fair amount of tradition and passing on of approaches in the world of assessment. And if we think about why that's the case, why do assessment practices endure? Why are they very often resistant to change? There's an element of conservatism here, that people like to do things in the way that they've always been done, and therefore there's resistance to change, fear of the unknown, fear of the new. There's also, and this is something I'll highlight as we go through today, gaps in teachers' assessment literacy. We've heard a lot in recent years about the importance of digital literacy, but in the same way, assessment literacy for teachers has become quite a big focus of educational research in practice last year, in recent years. And what that means is that it's become clear that in order for assessment practices to be effective, teachers need to have assessment literacy competences, knowledge, skills, which allow them to assess effectively. And I'll say a bit more about that shortly, but clearly, generally speaking, assessment practices don't change, don't evolve, because very often there are gaps in the assessment literacy of teachers. Another reason perhaps why assessment practices don't change is simply because we don't really reflect that much on how we assess students. We tend to reflect on what we do, we reflect on our lessons. When we talk about reflection, it typically involves teachers thinking back on a lesson or an activity and how effective, how successful it was, and how it might be changed next time. But we tend not to do the same for our assessment practices. In other words, I've rarely encountered teachers who say, yeah, when we do an assessment, later on we reflect on how effective it was and how we might improve it in future. Assessment tends not to be a common focus of reflection, and that's another reason why assessment practices tend not to evolve. So if you think about assessment literate teachers and what we mean, there's been plenty of literature on this recently. One source here says that assessment literature teachers know how to apply proper assessment methods. They know how to develop quality assessment exercises or tasks and to design appropriate scoring criteria. Assessment literate teachers know how to avoid bias in assessment. In other words, they're fair, they're objective. They also know how to communicate effectively about student achievement and also to use assessment as an instructional intervention. This is, again, a new idea for many teachers, the idea that assessment can be used for instructional purposes, the idea that assessment can be used to inform decisions about teaching, which is fundamentally what we mean when we talk about formative assessment. So these are some of the core competences that are noted when we talk about assessment literate teachers, but I'd like to add a few others that connect with my interests in teacher cognition. So I think that assessment literate teachers also hold appropriate beliefs about assessment, about the purposes of assessment, for example. Assessment literate teachers also are able to apply practices that reflect such beliefs. So they're able not just to have appropriate beliefs about assessment, but then to implement them in a way that's consistent. And also, and this is the main focus of our talk today, assessment literate teachers understand how assessment affects students. And again, this is not something, in my experience, that a lot of teachers think about much. The impact that assessment practices have on how students feel generally, and specifically about a subject. In our case, of course, the subject is English. So what we're saying is the way that we assess students does have an impact on how they feel about the subject we teach. And one of our goals as teachers should be to assess in a way that creates positive feelings about our subject rather than negative ones. What can we do to achieve that? That's what we'll explore today. Okay, so if you've got a device handy, you might want to scan that code or go to menti.com, and let's just do a very, very quick initial assessment of your views about assessment. There are 5 quick questions there on an agreement scale. So if you'd like to just scan that, go in there, put your answers in, and we'll see what that tells us about the group. And I'll show you the answers straight away. If for some reason the link or the code is not working, tell me and we'll fix that.
Yeah, it works perfectly.
Okay, thank you. And if I just switch my screen, you should be able, I hope, to see the responses there as well.
Yes, we can see them.
There's no right or wrong answers here, of course. It's just a matter of thinking about what your views are. Okay, so let's have a look at what these tell us, and what sort of issues they raise. I'll go back to my slides in a minute. I'm aware you can't see those, but I'll share again when I continue. So we've got assessment should give students a chance to show what they know, and you can still see the results there. So 5 is greater agreement. The higher the number, the greater agreement. And I think it's a really important message that to promote, to communicate with the teachers and the student teachers that we work with, because very often assessment is seen by educators to be an opportunity to find out what students don't know. But it really is important to approach assessment much more positively. It's an opportunity for students to show what they know. The second one, and you can see where you are as a group on that. An average of 3.5 means sort of you're inclined towards the agreement side of the scale, but not particularly strongly. Ideally that would be stronger there. Assessment should increase student motivation to learn. It's great that the agreement levels are so high there, and that's again a message that we need to communicate with the teachers and student teachers that we work with, because again, teachers very often don't think of assessment as a motivational tool. It's very often approached in more punitive terms, whereas we can do a lot more to present and promote assessment a lot more positively. The third one is about whether assessment, like going to the dentist, can never be a pleasant experience for students. Again, edging towards the agreement side of the scale there. As a group, you're saying, yeah, probably it's true that it can never be pleasant. There's always going to be a certain amount of tension and challenge and difficulty associated with assessment, but one of the messages I'd like to promote today is it doesn't have to be a destroyingly unpleasant experience for students. There are ways of making assessment more positive, as we'll see. Next one, assessment should help students become aware of what they don't know. Okay, that is important. Okay, the assessment has an important diagnostic function as well. As long as the approach is not overly negative with an explicit focus on deficits, but balanced by a focus on opportunities for development and learning, I think that's a justifiable position to take. And finally, it's about how we explain situations where students underperform or don't perform as well as we think they should. And you're right; it's sort of right in the middle there. Is it because they didn't study enough? That, in some cases, for some students, will be the reason. But very often, the results are a product of the design of the assessment, the administration of the assessment, the scoring of the assessment as well. So sometimes when students don't well, going back to the point we made about reflecting on our assessment practices, it's important for us, the teachers, to say, well, why did that happen? What factors contributed to lower than expected performance? Was it entirely down to the students, or were there factors within the assessment itself that could have been improved, which would have allowed students to do better? So let's just switch back to the slides. So one of the statements we looked at there was about whether assessment has to be, a necessary unpleasant experience. And when I was preparing this talk, I spoke to a student just to see what they felt about this, a secondary school student, and I asked them, does assessment have to be an unpleasant experience? And here's what they said. Of course, this is a sample of one, and we're not trying to make more out of it than it is. But it's interesting to see some student perspectives, because I think these are very often lacking when we talk about assessment. So this student said, yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree that assessment is unpleasant. You have to study, you have to learn all these different things for the test. It's just based on memory, mostly, not on your actual skills. So the question for all of us to be thinking about is, if we ask the larger group of students that we work with a similar question, how might they answer? Are they going to agree, as the student does, that assessment does tend to be unpleasant because it's just studying for the purpose of the test and then you move on? Or, it is possible, of course, that they've got more positive perspectives as well. With this student, I also said, but is there anything pleasant about test? Okay, I understand that generally you see it as an unpleasant experience. Is there anything pleasant? And here's what they said. I said, yeah, to be honest, it's pleasant because you're done with it. So the happy part of it for them is when it's over. You get your mark, you don't have to worry about that anymore. And ideally we'd want students to feel that there's more to assessment, that they're getting more out of assessment, more pleasure out of assessment than simply the pleasure of knowing like it's done. In this sense, it is like a trip to the dentist, because we are relieved when it's over, even though maybe the pain may persist for some time. So, as I said, one important part of assessment literacy is to think more broadly about why we assess. And for many teachers, of course, assessment is to do with measuring learning. That is a fundamental and justifiable reason for assessing students. To guide planning, so the information we get from assessments can help us plan subsequent lessons. Those are two purposes of assessment that I think are widely acknowledged by teachers. But there are others, as I've already said. Assessing to motivate students, so the motivational benefits of assessment, and assessing to let students shine, to give students opportunities to perform and to show what they know. And in my experience of working with teachers, these two reasons for assessment at the bottom tend to emerge less frequently. Teachers are all aware of the top two. But again, I think in our work with teachers and with student teachers, when we teach them courses on assessment, it really is important to hammer home the message that assessment, when done properly, can motivate students, and of course should always give students opportunities to demonstrate what they know. So there are plenty of resources out there. This is just one of many which explicitly connects assessment and motivation. And if you can read that there at the top, it says teachers can take small actions to ensure that the test they give builds confidence, refine skills, encourage independence. These are all ways of creating positive feelings about assessment. And at the bottom there, it says assessment is best viewed, or can be viewed, not just as a tool to judge attainment and progress, but can also boost how students feel about the subject. So there are many resources like this out there which we can share with the teachers and student teachers we work with. So what can we do as teachers then, as educators, to make assessment a more positive experience? And to do that, we need to think about different stages of the process. So we've got the preparation stage, we've got the design stage, we've got the actual administration. Now, I won't say much about administration moving forward. Administration is to do with the physical context in which an assessment is conducted. But clearly, if students are in a very cold room, or if they're in a very hot room, or in a cramped room, if they haven't eaten for 3 days, etc., hopefully not. These are all physical circumstances which will affect. I don't know, if they're given a sheet of paper with instructions and it's badly copied or illegible, these are all factors which affect their performance as well. But I won't say much more about that. There's the marking stage, or the assessment stage, scoring stage, feedback, and the evaluation, which, as I explained earlier, is the stage where we reflect as educators on the effectiveness of the assessment we've done. So the question for us is, what can we do at each of these stages to make assessment a more positive experience for our students? Okay, so let's go through each stage and see what happens. So at the preparation stage, there's a lot we can do at the preparation stage to make assessment a more positive experience for our students. So we can give students information about when the assessment will be, how long it's going to last, if it's a timed activity, what the assessment is going to cover, the actual content that might be assessed, how is to do with the format of the assessment, and the criteria is information about how their performance will be judged. Now, a lot of teachers I've worked with, of course, they always tell the students when it's going to be, although in many contexts, where oral assessment is quite common. So I live in Slovenia these days, and like much of Eastern Europe, there is still a very strong oral testing culture within schools. So students do some written assessments, but there is a lot of the assessment is done orally, and you can be asked at any time. So in that case, teachers might say next week I'm going to start asking, but you won't know exactly when. If it's a written test, of course, you'll know the exact date. But the key ones here are to do with what is going to be covered. So giving students a sense of the syllabus that they need to be familiar with, giving students a sense of how the question formats, and of course, importantly, giving them a sense of the criteria. So going back to the student I mentioned earlier, I asked them, if you had to give the teacher or your teachers some advice on how to make tests a less negative experience for students, what would you say? And this is in relation to, to content. The student said, well, I'd like the teacher to be more specific about what's going to be on the test in advance, telling us. They should say that everything from here to here can or cannot be on the test, for example. And then maybe like examples of questions that could be in a test. It's going to be like this and this. So they want information about content. They want information about format. Not, as the student said, you go and there's a question you've never heard of before, never seen, and you're not sure what to do with it. So it's quite unfair for students if the first time they encounter a particular task type or question format is when they're being assessed. That's something really we should avoid and cover as part of the preparation. And if we do that, students go into the assessment with a lot more certainty, with a lot more confidence, rather than worrying about what the teacher's going to do to surprise them. And unfortunately, that seems to be the approach that many teachers take to assessment, thinking of ways in which they can surprise students, which is slightly contrary to the message I'm trying to promote in this talk today. Catching students out, trying to find out what they don't know, that shouldn't be the main drivers for us as educators when we plan assessments. Okay, so that was what we can do at the preparation stage. Now, what can we do at the stage when we design assessments? Well, there's large volumes of literature on how to prepare assessments and design assessments effectively. But for us as language educators, there are some fundamental principles to keep in mind. We need to make sure that we are actually assessing language and not something else. I'll give you an example in a minute. We need to make sure we assess what has been taught, not something else that hasn't been taught. Ideally, unless you're teaching a course which deals very specifically with a single competence, you might be teaching a course on speaking, for example, only. But if you're teaching general English, you should be assessing a range of language competences, knowledge and skills. You need to, ideally, in an assessment, use a range of tasks, assessment tasks and formats that students are already familiar with, as we've already said. Language needs to be presented in a contextualized way in assessment, and I'll show you some examples of what happens when that's not the case. And also choice. I think choice is desirable in assessment within reasonable limits. And again, I'll give you an example of that in a minute. So look at these examples here. These are from real sort of assessments or test questions that teachers I've worked with, teachers of English I've worked with, have used. So if we look at the first two, the question is write down the country. The first one is Tom lives in Vienna. He is from. Now, we all know that the answer is Austria. But do we know that for linguistic, because of our linguistic knowledge, or because of our general knowledge? And for me, this is about general knowledge. linguistically, you can't get from Vienna to Austria. The only way you can get there is from general knowledge. So this is a question which is not testing language as such. Of course, they need to know that Austria is Austria in English, but yeah, there's no linguistic way of getting from Vienna to Austria. It's geography. And it's the same in the second question. I mean, the target answer is China, but you can only get there if you know that Beijing is in China, or if you can maybe guess that Liu is a common name in China, for example. So these are examples of questions that I see quite often in tests, primary school tests very often. But if we think closely about what they're testing, it's not really language. The third one is a bit better in a sense. It's right down the nationality. Tom is from Austria. He is, and there's some kind of transformation which is linguistic in nature to get from Austria to Austrian. There is a linguistic pattern there for getting from the name of a country to the nationality of the country, which students could learn and be expected to reproduce. These are simple examples, but they make the point quite clearly, I think, that very often what we're assessing is not necessarily language. This happens very often because teachers are testing content from their textbook. And the textbook will cover lots of topics, and teachers sometimes expect students to know not necessarily the language, but the actual information and content that's there. Here's another comment from the student where they talk about sort of the coverage of tests and how upsetting it is for students when something they expect to be on the test isn't there, and vice versa. So this student was saying, well, in a lesson, the teacher will say, okay, now write this down. And we write it down, and we expect that to be on the test. But instead of that, when we get the question, instead of that, it's something he mentioned once in passing. Or even we write down a ridiculous amount of things, we study all of those things, and then they're not on the test. So we can see here the negative impact on students and how they feel about the subject, about the teacher perhaps even, when this happens. And this is something we can easily control as teachers. All we need to be doing is being clear with the students in advance of an assessment of what the assessment is going to cover. It doesn't mean we're giving them the exact questions. We're just saying, look, these are the topics you need to be familiar with. These are the areas, themes, language, skills that you need to be prepared for the next assessment. So there's no uncertainty. And of course, once we define what's going to be tested or assessed, we need to stick to that. We can't all of a sudden throw something in that isn't there. That is unfair, and understandably, students react negatively. I talked about choice. How can we provide choice in a seminar? Here's a very simple example. So here's a picture, a very old picture from a book that I've had a very long time, because this is from Penier's 1988 book on grammar practice activities. I could ask you how many of you've got this book on your shelves, but that might be then you're figuring out how long you've been in the field. But it does have some nice sort of simple diagrams, drawings in it like this, and you can use this, for example, in a controlled way in assessment. You could say to the student, you can give them some sentences with words that are missing. It could be the elderly lady is in brackets cross, or no, the elderly lady in brackets cross the street, and the students would have to say the elderly lady is crossing the street. So you could use it in a controlled way, but if you look at the instructions at the top there, that's using it in a more creative way, still assessing the same target structure, but giving students some freedom. So if you say to them, write 5 sentences about what is happening in this picture, they still have to produce the same target structure. They still have to say the lady is crossing the road, the policeman is speaking to the driver, the waitress is handing the menu to the customers. They still have to practice that structure, but in a way that gives them a little bit of freedom to decide which sentences they're going to produce. Okay? in which they're going to produce. So these are simple ways in which we can give students some choice. If we want them to answer 5 questions, we can give them 6. Choose 5. If there's an exercise with 10 items, we can say answer 8. It doesn't change what we're assessing. It doesn't change how much control we have as teachers over the assessment. It's just giving students a bit more choice. It's giving them more opportunities to demonstrate what they know. In contrast, if we have one question that carries most of the marks, and for some reason the student can't perform on that particular question, then of course they're going to fail the assessment. But they may not be necessarily because they didn't prepare or didn't know. It may just be because they couldn't perform on that question. So choice links in nicely with the theme of giving students opportunities to demonstrate what they know. I mean, for those of you who want to be more creative, there are all sorts of pictures you can find online. This is one that tends to amuse me. I'm not quite sure where all these people are dressed in the same way and wearing similar wigs. You might need to go and investigate that. I'm sure there was some kind of theme going on there. But again, you could use a picture like this in assessment quite creatively in a way that gives students choice about what to say, what to write. Okay, but there are plenty of pictures out there we can use. And of course, with the advent of AI today, we can even get assistance from AI to generate pictures for us. Okay, we're sort of about the halfway mark. Assessment isn't really a topic that, in my experience, lends itself to humor. But if you go online and search a little bit, you do find there are jokes about assessment out there. And of course, I know that humor is a very subjective thing, so you may or may not smile at these, or you may grimace at these. But while I have a sip of water, just very quickly read these two, please. Okay, I can see a couple of smiles, but most of you have your cameras off, so I can't really tell whether you're smiling or groaning, but that's okay. That's okay. It's more a chance for me to get a sip of water. All right, what can we do at the marking stage to make assessment a more positive experience for students? Well, again, there are several things we can do. Mark against the criteria that you've previously shared with students. We've said it's important to share the criteria with students. If you've shared those criteria, then of course it's important to mark against those criteria, not against some other criteria, or to ignore your criteria completely. So if you say to students, I'm not going to penalize you for spelling mistakes, for example, but then you do, then that's a big problem. And that the consequence of that is negative feelings among students. We need to mark fairly without favorites, for example. We need to mark consistently. If an answer is wrong, it's wrong for everyone. We need to mark accurately. In other words, we can't say we is going. We can't say that's correct because it's not correct. And of course, we need to mark in a way that rewards knowledge, not just penalizes, I think, the absence of knowledge. So there are things we can do there at the marking, at the scoring stage, again, to improve the experience for students. So here are some examples of that maybe are not in the spirit of the approach I'm describing here. These are also taken from tests I've seen used in primary schools here. The first one, write a possessive adjective. That's complete the blank with the possessive adjective. Now, if I asked you to suggest an answer to that question, you'll come up with all sorts of creative possibilities. And in one example I saw, this is what the student wrote. The student wrote, "Do you like my grandparents?" And there's nothing grammatically wrong with that. Nothing grammatically wrong. But the teacher said, no, that's wrong. And the student got no mark for that. And this happened because the teacher already had a predetermined idea about what they wanted the student to write. I think the teacher wanted the student to write your. Do you like your grandparents? But grammatically, there's nothing wrong with my, and therefore it's completely unfair to say to the student that you're wrong. Part of the problem for that, of course, is there's no context for a question like that. And remember what I said earlier, it really is important for us to place language assessment in context. Language needs to be presented in context, particularly when we're asking students to complete exercises such as this one. You can see a second one there. Scotland is part of the UK, but has got its own. I don't know if anyone wants to put on their microphone and shout out an answer here. Go ahead if you'd like to. Go on. I can see you want to.
Mariana, yes.
Hello, good morning. I don't know. I was just like mumbling, thinking of trying to answer.
Okay,
that.
just say something. Scotland is part of the UK, but has got its own. Mariana or anyone else? We don't want to put Mariana on the spot.
Government.
Government, okay. Yeah. That's factually correct.
Flag.
Flag. Yep. Okay. So straight away we can see, because the nature of the question means there are multiple possible answers here which are factually correct. Now, the student in this case wrote down football team, which is also correct. But once again, the teacher said, no, sorry, that's wrong. Why? Because in the book it says parliament. In the book it says parliament. And that's what the teacher wanted. But there's nothing in the question that guides the students towards that. It's just a badly designed question, and the students are being unfairly penalized because they're being almost assessed on their ability to remember the content of the textbook rather than to produce language that's appropriate in this context. So this is the sort of thing we should avoid because it's unfair on the students. Now, when we get to feedback, of course, there are, again, many things we can do to make it a more positive experience for students. Focus on strengths, not just on negatives. Highlight weaknesses, of course, but in not just weaknesses. Some of the feedback I see is all about what students have done wrong, and that's it. But there are always things to say you did well as well. Provide advice on what they can do differently next time. Otherwise, how are they going to improve? Make sure your feedback is selective. If students have written an essay, it's not possible and it's not useful to go through and mark every single problem that you can spot. Make sure the feedback is relevant to the task that they were asked to do. And make sure, of course, as we're saying, that it's constructive. That the overall feeling that students get as a result of feedback is a good one, where they're able to say, yeah, I made a few mistakes here, but I can see what they are and I know what to do to improve them, and I'm motivated to go ahead and do that, rather than feeling destroyed because the teacher has just ripped through their paper or through their exercise, used up 3 red pens in the purpose, and left a student with feeling terrible, which is very often what happens. And as educators, we're very often not aware of how our feedback impacts on students, because we're, of course, I know we've got very often stacks of assignments and exercise books to mark, and perhaps we haven't got enough time to think about how what we're writing is impacting on the students. But it really is good to take a bit of time sometimes just to step back and say, okay, how is this feedback affecting the student who's going to read it? It's good to have a quick discussion with your students sometime as a group once you've given them feedback to see how they feel about the feedback. It might be a painful discussion for you as an educator sometimes to understand how they feel or to realize how they feel, but it's an important thing for us to do. One of the test papers I was looking at had this written at the top. That was the feedback in red, written across the top of the test paper assessment. It said, "You should work hard!" Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, in red. That was the feedback the student got. And again, what is the student expected to do with this? Maybe the student did work hard and for various reasons just wasn't able to perform well, maybe because the assessment wasn't appropriately designed. So this kind of feedback doesn't really help students improve. It doesn't help them like the subject. It creates negative feelings. I asked the student I've mentioned a few times how they feel about feedback. This is a more extended conversation. I said to them, can you think of a situation where the teachers are giving you feedback on your performance, and because of that feedback, you felt better? And the student said, yeah, if a teacher says, I did well on a test or something. So telling the student they did well makes them feel better. And I said, well, that's when you do well, but what about when you don't do well? And the student said, well, they don't really say anything. They just say, oh, you didn't do well. And we continued our conversation. I said, well, how do you feel when you get a page of writing back from the teacher? No, a page of writing that you've done, and it's all red. It's all been marked in red by the teacher. And the student said, annoyed mostly. Why annoyed? Well, because if you got the answers wrong, there's nothing you can do about that on an essay. There's no need. Like, you make a mistake once and she writes a whole paragraph. Why did you do this? And fills up your whole page. I've had entire paragraphs written under my test with everything I did wrong. And I said, so that kind of detailed feedback doesn't make you feel good? And the student said, no, because it's not feedback. It's, you did this wrong. And that's a really interesting insight. The student is saying that's not even feedback. They don't even see that necessarily as feedback, because for them, feedback is something that's going to help them improve. But being told you did this wrong and you did that wrong, full stop, is not really helping them. And they see that. And it's a shame that many teachers go there through their careers and use up many red pens in the process without ever being aware of how students feel about the feedback they're getting. Because I do think that teachers generally believe that what they're giving the students back is helpful. I'm not saying the teachers do this purposefully, but they're just not aware of how students perceive the value or lack of value of such feedback. Okay, I talked earlier about the last stage of the process, which is when we evaluate, when we reflect on our processes. So we've designed, administered, scored an assessment, provided feedback on it. We're at the end of the process. Not quite. Let's reflect a little bit on its effectiveness. And of course, we can't do this all the time because we're very busy. But occasionally, it's good if we can find some space just to step back, and maybe alone or even with colleagues, just to think about the effectiveness of our evaluation. How did the students perform is a good place to start. If they all failed, straight away, that's a red flag. If everyone fails, there's a problem somewhere. If they all score 100%, I'd also say there's a problem somewhere. So how did they perform, and what can we make of that? Why did they perform in the way they did? If they all failed, what factors contributed to that? Probably it was something in the design of the paper. Maybe I didn't give them clear information about what they needed to study. Maybe they weren't familiar with the tasks. Maybe there were some factors in the administration. Similarly, if they all did extremely well, we don't just pat ourselves on the shoulder, say well done. We need to say, well, maybe it was a bit too easy, for example, because test assessment should discriminate across levels. How did the students feel about it? A question that many educators never ask. How did the students feel about the assessment? Did they feel it was fair or not? And we need to ask them, of course, to get that kind of information. And based on our reflections, how could my assessment, this assessment or other assessments in future, be improved? And improved in the sense that they are a more positive learning experience for students. So we've been through all these stages and thought about the negative impacts that assessments can have on students, and some simple things that we can do to address that? And what sort of key points would I like you maybe to take away to think about? One is clearly to be aware that assessment affects student well-being. It affects how they feel about the subject and possibly about the teacher as well. So if students are not liking English, very often one reason for that might be, the way it's being assessed. Not the only reason, but it does have an effect. I don't believe that assessment has to be, an unbearably unpleasant experience. Challenging, yes, depending on the consequences. If it's a high stakes assessment, of course, there's always a bit of tension, but it doesn't have to be unpleasant. It doesn't have to be an unpleasant experience. We've talked about 6 stages. It's not the sort of acronym that rolls off the tongue, but if you remember: preparation, design, administration, marking or scoring, feedback, and evaluation. And think about what we can do at each stage of the process to make assessment a more positive experience for students. Small adjustments can improve the process. Small adjustments can improve the process technically, in the sense that they'll give us more valid assessment data, but that also can improve the process motivationally. So, remember what we said earlier about assessment as a motivational tool as well. It's really important for us as educators to keep on top of our assessment literacy, to think about what we know, where we need to know more around assessment literacy. I'll show you some resources in a minute, but it's impossible to conduct assessment effectively unless we've got the assessment literacy skills to underpin that. And vitally, I think part of the process is talking about assessment with students and colleagues. The only way we can really understand how it affects students is to ask them. We have discussions with them, ask them for feedback, and talking to colleagues about assessment as well is always a valuable thing, not just in terms of how colleagues assess students, but also, are they reflecting on what they're doing? Have they got any thoughts on how it's perceived from students' point of view? So a few resources here maybe to take away if you're interested. The one on the right, the Handbook of Assessment for Language Teachers, is based on an EU project designed to boost teachers' literacy assessment. That handbook is freely available on the project website. On the other side of the screen at the top, I've written a couple of blogs about assessing children and about assessment from a teacher point of view, from a teacher development point of view, which you might want to have a read. And at the bottom there, the British Council's Teaching English website also has plenty of resources that focus on assessment and the assessment of different skills. So these are just some of many resources that are out there to help us with our assessment work. Don't forget the website I mentioned earlier about motivational strategies in connection with assessment. So thank you very much. I will stop there, and we'll see if you've got any questions, and in the time we've got, we'll discuss some of those. Thank you. I'll just stop sharing the screen. And
yes, thank you very much, Professor Borg, for such an insightful and inspiring presentation. I think your ideas on making assessment a positive experience gave us a fresh and practical way to think about how assessment can truly support and motivate our learners. And also, thank you very much for sharing all those resources. Yes, we have some minutes for questions, comments. Okay, Ana Dominguez, please.
Anna, we can't hear you. She's on mute. She's is she in a vehicle?
Right. Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing your knowledge over assessment. It's really important, this subject. But I have a question about evaluating or assessing vocabulary, because when you show the examples about nationalities and countries, well, when we test grammar, we also test vocabulary. And so can you give us what technique can we use then for testing vocabulary with our students? And the other question I have is about writing. If we don't mark students like where they have the errors, not correcting, but just showing the errors, would that be also considered something demotion, that demotivates them, or what can we do? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So let me take the second question first, because the idea here is that it may be the case that students expect teachers to mark every single error on their work, and if teachers are not doing that, somehow maybe the students are not happy with that. So then there's a question about having a conversation with students and establishing clear and shared expectations. I don't think it's reasonable or even productive if a student's written an essay to go through it and mark every possible linguistic problem that's there, because there are always many that we can find at all levels of language. So I think it's important to have a focus. Instead, at the moment, we're focusing on, I don't know, sentence structure, we're focusing on tenses, we're focusing on vocabulary, and then to make sure that the feedback addresses that. But students need to be told this so they understand what the teacher is trying to do. If you don't tell them that, then the students might feel the teacher's being lazy, they didn't even mark all my errors, whereas what you're doing is quite principled. Briefly, the question about vocabulary, the important thing is that vocabulary needs to be assessed in context. Otherwise, you have the kinds of ambiguities that I illustrated in some of these things. And the questions need to be testing not general knowledge, as I illustrated, but making actually there's a context, and which gives the student the opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge of linguistic knowledge. As I said, the examples I gave you were more general knowledge. If you know that Vienna is in Austria, you can get it right. If you don't know that, you're in trouble. You might know the word Austria, but you might not know that, the connection with Vienna. So the general thing about vocabulary and grammar is to make sure that we're presenting language in a context which gives students a clear sense of what's expected and what the correct answer might be. The other thing is not to mark incorrectly answers which are correct and which demonstrate creativity, but they're just not the ones you were expecting. I think we need to reward students who are able to do that. Thank you. Let's take another question. I'll try not to dwell too long on any one to give as many people as possible the chance.
Okay. Yes, we have a question from Kimberly. She asks, what advice would you give for discussing this topic with colleagues who might not have the same mindset regarding positive assessment?
Well, I guess now that you've recorded my talk, you can ask them to sit down and watch it, and hopefully that might have some small impact, so they don't say that they can see that you're not the only person trying to persuade them, but there are others who are like-minded. But what tends to happen, you get one or two people in a department who embrace a new idea, start working on it, and it's a slow process, then a gradual process of trying to bring others on board. So next time you have a staff meeting, can you allocate 10 minutes for someone to talk a little bit about, hey, what do we know about how our students feel about the way we assess them? Has anyone ever asked students that question? And you take it from there. There will always be people, unfortunately, who are not interested. We do our best to involve them and support them. But at the end of the day, if they don't, then we move on, and hopefully most people are moving forward and making positive changes in their work.
Great. And we have time for one last question. So I don't know. Okay, Ken, please go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Borg.
Hi.
First of all, thank you so much for joining us. I'm one of the professors here on staff at the University of Guanajuato, and you've always been one of my academic heroes. So it's just really thrilling to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I know we're running out of time, so I'll make this as quick as possible. You talked about the problem of traditional views and perspectives about assessment and testing. But to my mind, the most traditional perspective about testing is the need to test at all in the language classroom. I don't really see a need for it myself because there's not really much information that can be put to use. If you tell a student that they're getting all their verbs wrong when they speak, for instance, what does a student do with that? You learn languages through practice and through feedback, of course, but not necessarily testing feedback. It's a non-linear process and it's not a body of knowledge. Therefore, I don't really see the need for testing at all. And I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
It is a perspective. I guess the challenge with that is that education is also always takes place within a system, and in most educational systems, formal assessment is is part of the deal. So if you happen to work in a context where you have the freedom to implement that kind of philosophy, and it's accepted and it's beneficial, there's no reason to oppose it. The challenge is that all of us, we always work within a system, and to a certain extent, the system is going to constrain what we can and cannot do. So students need to be given grades on courses, and in order to get grades, they need to do something, which is going to be assessed by someone in some way. So you've got freedom about perhaps how you assess, what you assess, the criteria used, the kind of feedback you provide. I think you've got a lot of freedom with all of those, and you can approach those in a way that reflects your philosophy. At the end of the day, though, your head of department or someone else is still going to ask you for a list of the students with numbers next to their names or grades to the next to their names. And as long as we work within a system, it's difficult to see a way of escaping that. But I say it shouldn't stop you innovating around the elements of assessment that you're able to. That's my fairly realistic take on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Simon, and I really thank you for accepting to give this presentation in this seminar, and we hope to see you very soon, hopefully in another talk, right?
Thank you. It's been my pleasure joining you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday, and you can maybe continue talking a little bit more about assessment in the days ahead, and just reflect on how anything I've said is relevant to the work of your department, and see if there's anything you can incorporate into your practices. Okay. So thank you again for the invitation. Lovely being with you, and as Edgar says, hope to see you again sometime soon.
Yes. Take care.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Les recordamos que la inauguración del seminario comienza a las 3 de la tarde por si quieren acompañarnos, y sería con el mismo acceso de Zoom. Y pues bueno, comenzamos formalmente el seminario a las 3 de la tarde. Muchísimas gracias y nos vemos en un rato. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.